On February 12th, in 2002, I was convicted of violating the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act of 1986 and about 20 other related crimes. I was sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security prison. On June 2nd, 2002, I was released from prison and sent on my way. I was not placed on probation or parole. Those not intimately familiar with my case might scoff at the above statements, but they're completely factual. It's the events that occurred during that 4-month period that are the reason my sentence was commuted and I was sent home. I arrived at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri on February 13th of 2002 at roughly 9 in the morning. The 2 U.S. Marshals who delivered me handed the intake officer a stack of paperwork and signed a form before leaving me in the care of the Bureau of Prisons. I was 18 years old and wet behind the ears. I had a lengthy juvenile record, but this was the big leagues. A guard read through my intake form and said, "Hacker, huh? You a homo or something?" I replied, "No, of course not." He laughed. "If you're a homo, you should tell me now. Homos go to a special cell block." He proceeded to do a cavity search and corralled me into a shower where he sprayed me with a hose and then issued me my prisoner uniform, shoes, belt, hygiene supplies, a towel, blanket, and badge with my prisoner number on it. I was lucky. I had been assigned to C Block. C Block had private rooms and a common area. My room was a 10-foot by 6-foot cell that had a single bunk, a jail toilet with a sink in the basin, and a locker that served as a nightstand and a table. There was a camera in the upper left-hand corner over this 3-inch thick steel door with a single tempered glass window at just about eye level. Okay, so now that I've given you an idea of what kind of place I was at, let me go down to brass tacks. This was a giant stone building where every imaginable evil was committed on a daily basis for the better part of 70 years by the time I got there. I'm not asking you to believe in ghosts, but that prison is haunted. Inmates would report hearing rustling noises outside their doors or knocking on the walls behind their cells. Nearly everyone on C Block had a story about Old Jim. Old Jim was a guard during the riot of 1941. Legend has it he turned the corner onto C Block and the inmates tackled him to the ground and raped him to death. Other versions of the story claim they raped him and then stabbed him. Point is, he died horribly. On some nights when we were supposed to be asleep, we'd stand at our meal flaps and have conversations through the crack. Every now and then, we'd hear keys jingling and footsteps in the hall. If anyone was brave enough to look up, they'd see nothing, if they were lucky. Anyone that reported to have looked Old Jim in the eyes was called a liar. As the story goes, if you look Old Jim in the eyes, he'll come to your cell and kill you. More than one inmate had been found mutilated in their cell over the years. Even with the cameras in place, there was no evidence that anyone had been inside the cell aside from the victim. We traded Old Jim sightings like campfire stories, but he was far from the only ghost. My cell in particular was especially terrifying. Unlike most cells, I had a grate in my ceiling. It had been bolted up with mesh wire, but that didn't stop a previous occupant from making rope out of his sheet and hanging himself. Some nights, when it was dark and everyone was asleep, I'd wake up and see this guy dangling over me. I'd close my eyes as quickly as I could. I asked Sarge, one of the inmates I'd developed a bit of a friendship with, about it. He said that it was this Nazi guy that died in my cell back in the 50s. A nasty storm rolled in one afternoon and knocked the power out. By that evening, the backup generators had gone out. C Block was on lockdown. The guard sat in his office smoking, as the rest of us were forced to do without. We could smoke on an enclosed stoop 4 times a day, but even the electric lighter on the wall was about useless at that point. The snoring from the end of the hall meant the guard was asleep. Larry was a good guy, and none of us had a problem with him. He had a habit of falling asleep, and most nights that wouldn't have been a problem, but the magnetic doors weren't working. The main door to the cell block still used a key, but all the interior doors had been upgraded. Larry was asleep in an unlocked office that contained a load of contraband on a cell block that housed 2 serial killers, a Marine that went on a rampage, and about a dozen killers, 4 terrorists, and a hacker. It did not end well for him. Tyrell was a gangbanger from Chicago convicted of killing a DEA agent. Larry had busted Tyrell several times for trying to gain entry to the hygiene cabinet in the guard office. Larry was asleep and Tyrell wasn't confined to his cell. Larry didn't even have a chance to scream. I doubt he even woke up. Tyrell grabbed Larry's nightstick and his keys. As he went for the door, we all heard a jingling noise that sent all of us back to our cells. I didn't watch, but what I heard was bad enough. Tyrell screamed, and then I heard him being dragged across the floor and down the hall. His hands made wet slaps against the smooth tile as he tried to pull himself from old Jim's grip. We heard the shower come on and one final scream before the keys began jingling down the hall again. I looked up from my position crouching inside the door and saw the Nazi hanging there. I heard him say the phrase, "Gott ist tot." Bernie, a former dentist and convicted serial killer, lived in the cell across from me. I heard Bernie shout, but I was paralyzed with fear. It was only when I saw the Nazi clawing at his noose that I moved out of the door with my eyes to the floor and headed for the common room. By this point, everyone was screaming. Everyone, that is, except Sarge. Sarge reached out of his door and grabbed my shoulder. I would have liked to have had a heart attack right there on the spot, but he pulled me in and told me to be quiet. Sarge wasn't innocent. He openly admitted to his crimes, something that was rare in prison. While he was deployed to Iraq during Desert Storm, 2 men broke into his house and kidnapped his daughter. He received the news after returning from a mission. At that very moment, he went AWOL, found his way back to the States, and tracked those men down. By the time he was finished, you could have fit their remains in a shoebox. He turned himself in the next day. Sarge whispered, "I think you'll be fine, kid, but I'm fucked." I whispered back, "What do you mean? Huh?" Sarge got close and said, "All of us are lifers who deserve to be here. You fiddled with a computer. Big whoop. Look, kid, my grandmother was a medicine woman and told me restless spirits can only hurt the damned. I don't think you're damned." I replied, But I'm an atheist." He laughed quietly. "Does this look like a situation where it makes sense to be an atheist?" I shook my head. The jingling sound was getting closer. By this point, the lights were flickering but weren't coming back on just yet. I looked up just as the lights flickered, and when it went dark again, I was staring old Jim directly in the eyes. Sarge shouted at the apparition, "Hey, ugly, I heard you went out like a bitch." Old Jim turned his head towards Sarge and knocked him to the ground. He then reached down and grabbed Sarge by the leg. Sarge looked back at me, shouting, "Get somewhere safe and don't open your eyes until the guards pull you out." He said this as he was dragged away. About a minute later, I heard bones crunching and Sarge screaming as I ran for the main door. The key was still in the lock. I turned it and ran to the smoking stoop. I sat there with my eyes closed for the next several hours. The sun came up, and with it came several guards that pulled me off the smoking stoop. I didn't respond. I was all but catatonic at that point. I had seen things no one should ever see and have lived through. I was moved to solitary for the better part of a week, and even still I didn't respond when questioned. It was only when I was brought to the warden that I showed any sign of being mentally present. The warden had brought me to his office, and I was put in a chair. He offered me some soda, but I didn't respond. Then he clasped his hands behind his back and walked over to his desk. After sitting down, he said, "This happened in 44, and again in 59. Before my time, mind you, but I read the reports. Never a survivor before. Honestly, we don't know what to do with you." I looked up at him. He smiled and continued. "I talked to a friend of mine with the federal prosecutor's office, and he said you're a non-violent offender that broke into a computer or something and made some threats. He and I had a talk with an appellate judge we know, and he ruled that certain evidence in your trial should have been ruled inadmissible." I relaxed a bit more and sat back in the chair as a slight grin came to my face. The warden offered me a soda. I said, "Yes, please." He then said, "I believe prison should be more about rehabilitation than incarceration. A lot of the sociopaths need to be locked away, but the ones that can be reformed should be reformed. Do you understand what I'm getting at?" I nodded. He continued, "I can't speak for whether or not you're a sociopath. That's a job for a psychiatrist. But you survived something that has on more than one occasion killed every last inmate on that block. Someone or something decided that you should live. Who am I to argue with a higher power?" He got up and turned towards the window. "Tomorrow morning, a pair of marshals will drive you to an airport in St. Louis where you'll be flown down to Nashville, Tennessee and released into your own custody. Your sentence has been commuted to time served without probation or parole." He paused and I said, "Thank you, sir." The warden turned around and, with an expression that looked like an equal mix of fear and sadness, he said, "I try not to think about the kinds of spirits that might inhabit this place, but you saw them firsthand. The official policy when an event like this happens in a government facility is to purge the records and deny any occurrence of supernatural activity. Now, I can't stop you from telling your story, but do me a favor and wait until I'm dead. I'd rather be safe in the Lord's arms when you reveal what really happened that night." I was led back to solitary confinement and released the next morning. I've kept this story to myself for the better part of 13 years now. To this day, I jump when I hear keys jingling at night. I've gotten by this long by trying to rationalize what I saw or why I saw it, but I don't have any answers that even begin to make sense. I kept my promise, though. Warden Michaels died last week at the age of 57.